Imagine the moment when you realized that everything you believed in, everything you fought for and sacrificed thousands of lives for, was doomed from the very beginning. This is exactly what the top military leaders of Nazi Germany faced. They were brilliant strategists, graduates of prestigious military academies, people who seemed invincible at the beginning of the war. Their armies swept across Europe like a deadly roller coaster, sweeping away one state after another. France fell in 6 weeks. Poland, in a month. Nothing seemed to be able to stop the German war machine. But somewhere between the triumphal marches through Paris and the frozen trenches near Moscow, something broke. Not all at once, not in one moment, but gradually, like a crack in an armor that expands with each blow. At first it was just anxiety, a small worry in the back of my mind. Then a doubt that couldn't be voiced out loud. And finally, the grim certainty that had to be hidden even from himself. These generals knew. They saw the numbers, understood the logistics, and read the reports from the front. They realized that the war was lost, perhaps years before the red banner flew over the Reichstag. But they continued to fight, continued to give orders that sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers to their deaths. The peak of power and the beginning of the end. In the summer of 1941, the German Wehrmacht was at the absolute peak of its power. In an incredibly short period of just 2 years, the armies of the Third Reich accomplished what seemed impossible. Poland was defeated in a few weeks in September 1939. Denmark surrendered in a day. Norway, despite the help of the British and French, fell 2 months later. But the real triumph was the campaign in the West. The Netherlands, Belgium and the seemingly impregnable France collapsed before the onslaught of the blitzkrieg in just 6 weeks. The French army, considered one of the strongest in the world, was defeated and humiliated. The British Expeditionary Force barely managed to evacuate through Dunkirk, abandoning all heavy weapons. The German generals, many of whom had been skeptical of Hitler and his adventurous plans, now felt fully justified. Their military doctrines, the concept of lightning warfare, the massive use of tank formations, close cooperation with aviation, all worked brilliantly. They have proven to be the greatest military minds of their generation. Guderian, Manstein, Rommel, Rundstedt, these names inspired fear throughout Europe. It seemed that there were no obstacles in front of the Wehrmacht that it could not overcome. And so on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa began, the invasion of the Soviet Union. 3.5 million German soldiers crossed the border on a front stretching for almost 2,000 kilometers. The first few weeks seemed like a repeat of previous triumphs. Guderian and Gotha's tank wedges penetrated deep into Soviet territory, encircling and destroying entire armies. By the end of the first week of the war, the Red Army had lost more than 3,000 aircraft, most of which were destroyed on the ground. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured in huge cauldrons of encirclement near Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. By the fall of 1941, many German officers were convinced that the war was practically won. They believed that the Soviet Union would collapse from the first powerful blow. Goebbels' propaganda trumpeted millions of prisoners, thousands of destroyed tanks and planes. It seemed that only a few weeks remained before the final victory. The first alarm signals. But amid the euphoria of victory, some veterans, especially those who went through the First World War, began to notice disturbing signs. The front was too wide, almost 2,000 kilometers, and it had to be held by forces that were designed for a much more compact theater of operations. The distances in Russia were monstrous. It's 1,000 kilometers from the border to Moscow, and almost 1,500 kilometers to Stalingrad. This is not France, where you can get from the border to Paris in a few days of march. Logistics started to malfunction almost immediately. The German army was only partially motorized, and most of its supplies were still carried out by horse-drawn vehicles. Roads in Russia turned out to be a nightmare, clouds of dust in summer, impassable mud in autumn, which bogged down not only carts, but also trucks. The railway network had a different gauge, which required rerouting the tracks or reloading all materials. Guderian's advanced tank formations raced forward with such speed that the supply columns simply could not keep up with them. Motorized divisions began to stall due to lack of fuel and ammunition. The equipment was out of order, not from enemy fire, but simply from wear and tear. Dusty Russian roads clogged the air filters of tanks and trucks, and sand penetrated the engines, accelerating their wear. And another problem that no one foresaw: the Red Army did not collapse. Yes, she suffered terrible losses. Yes, entire armies were surrounded. But Soviet soldiers continued to fight even in hopeless situations. They didn't give up en masse like the French. They fought for every town, every village. And most importantly, new armies appeared behind the defeated armies. The Soviet Union was mobilizing reserves that seemed endless. German intelligence constantly underestimated Soviet capabilities. Every week, divisions appeared at the front, the existence of which the German command did not even know. The disaster near Moscow. By November 1941, mild anxiety had turned into real terror. German troops approached Moscow so close that the officers could see the Kremlin towers through binoculars. But they were exhausted, drained of blood, and their supply line stretched for hundreds of kilometers. And then the Russian winter hit earlier and harder than anyone expected. The temperature dropped to -30 and below. The German soldiers did not have winter uniforms. It was planned that the war would end before winter. The equipment failed massively, the oil in the engines froze, the hydraulics of the tanks failed, the automatic weapons stopped firing. Soldiers suffered frostbite, and thousands lost fingers, ears, and legs. And on December 5, 1941, the unthinkable happened. The Red Army launched a counteroffensive near Moscow. Fresh Siberian divisions, specially trained and equipped for the Winter War, struck at the exhausted German units. For the first time in the entire war, the Wehrmacht was forced to retreat. For the first time, the German troops did not just stop, they ran back, abandoning equipment, weapons, and the wounded. Hitler forbade retreat, issuing the order to stand to the death. This prevented a complete rout, but the price was appalling. By the spring of 1942, the Wehrmacht had lost about 500,000 people killed, wounded and missing near Moscow. Logistical support was completely disrupted. The reserves accumulated over the years of preparation have been squandered. Morale cracked for the first time. It was then, in the winter of 1941-1942, that some German officers began to whisper among themselves for the first time, this war could no longer be won. Germany found itself embroiled in precisely the war of attrition that all German strategists had been so afraid of since the First World War. The blitzkrieg failed. The Soviet Union did not collapse. And ahead was a long, grueling struggle against an enemy that surpassed Germany in human resources, in territory, and in the potential of industry. The adventure of 1942. But Hitler was not ready to accept reality. In the spring of 1942, he demanded the resumption of offensive operations. His target was the oil fields of the Caucasus and the Volga, a vital transport artery of the Soviet Union. Operation Blau's plan was extremely ambitious, a simultaneous offensive into the Caucasus and Stalingrad, dividing forces over vast distances and stretching already overstretched supply lines. Field Marshal Fyodor von Bock, commander of Army Group South, openly protested against this plan. He warned that the dispersion of forces into two strategic directions would inevitably lead to disaster. He pointed out the weak flanks that would have to be covered by unreliable Romanian, Italian and Hungarian troops. He talked about logistical problems, the lack of reserves, and the growing power of the Red Army. Von Bock was dismissed for his dissent. Hitler brooked no objections, especially from generals who dared to question his strategic genius. The operation started according to his plan, and the first week seemed successful again. German troops were advancing into the Caucasus, capturing cities on the Volga. But every kilometer of progress made their position more vulnerable. The Stalingrad disaster. On November 19, 1942, what von Bock and other sober-minded officers had warned about happened. The Red Army launched a large-scale counteroffensive near Stalingrad. The blows were inflicted precisely on the weak sections of the front, which were held by Romanian and Italian troops. These formations, poorly armed and demoralized, could not withstand the onslaught of the Soviet tank corps and fled. In a few days, the entire German army was surrounded, the Sixth Army under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, about 300,000 soldiers and officers. Paulus begged Hitler to allow a breakthrough from the encirclement while it was still possible. But the Fuhrer forbade a retreat, promising to supply the surrounded group by air and organize a deblocking strike. The promises turned out to be empty. The Luftwaffe could not provide the necessary supplies. At least 500 tons of cargo were needed daily to supply the encircled army, and the German Air Force was able to deliver at best 100 tons. The unblocking strike of Manstein's group was choked before reaching Stalingrad, only 48 kilometers away. The encircled troops began to slowly die of hunger, cold, and disease. By February 1943, about 90,000 of the 300,000 surrounded remained, the rest died or were captured. On January 31st, Paulus, whom Hitler promoted to Field Marshal at the last moment, hinting that the German field marshals were not giving up, surrendered along with the remnants of his army. The psychological effect of Stalingrad was devastating. It was the first really major defeat of the Wehrmacht, which could not be hidden or downplayed. The whole of Germany was in mourning, but for the generals, it meant something more. It was proof that the Soviet Union would not only survive, but could also win. The Red Army has shown that it is capable of large-scale, brilliantly planned encirclement operations, the very operations that were considered the exclusive prerogative of the German General Staff. Kursk Bulge, the last hope. In the spring of 1943, the German command made a last attempt to turn the tide of the war in the east. Operation Citadel was planned, an offensive against the Kursk Bulge, where it was supposed to surround and destroy a large group of Soviet troops. For this strike, the best divisions of the Wehrmacht, the latest Tiger and Panther tanks, everything that Germany could still put on the battlefield were assembled. But the operation was postponed. Hitler wanted to wait for the arrival of new tanks. This delay proved fatal. The Soviet command was well aware of the impending offensive. It was given out by aerial reconnaissance, intelligence data, and simple logic. The Red Army has prepared a deeply layered defense that the world has never seen before: minefields, anti-tank trenches, firing points, reserves of tanks and artillery. When the German troops finally launched their offensive on July 5th, they were faced with a density of fire they could not have imagined. Tanks were blown up by mines, burned by anti-tank artillery, and destroyed by Il-2 attack aircraft. The advance was measured in kilometers, which were bought at the cost of hundreds of tanks and thousands of lives. 2 weeks later, it became clear that the offensive had failed. The Wehrmacht could not break through the Soviet defenses, could not encircle the Soviet troops, could not achieve any of its goals. And then the Red Army itself went on the offensive. And this offensive has not stopped. From Kursk to Berlin, Soviet troops advanced almost continuously, liberating territory after territory, city after city. The strategic initiative was finally and irrevocably transferred to the Soviet Union. Why did they keep fighting? By the fall of 1943, any sober-minded person in the German General Staff understood that the war was lost. The question was not whether Germany would win, but how long it would last and what the cost of defeat would be. But the generals continued to give orders, continued to send soldiers into battle, continued to function as parts of a huge military machine. Why? The answer lies in the very nature of the military system and the psychology of subordination. These people have been trained for one thing all their lives: to follow orders and achieve military goals. Their personality was shaped by the Prussian military tradition, where the concepts of duty, honor and discipline stood above everything else. For them, refusing to follow orders meant giving up on themselves, on everything they were. Moreover, there was a fear of consequences. After the failed assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20, 1944, which involved several high-ranking officers led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, mass repression began in the army. About 5,000 people were arrested and hundreds executed, many after horrific torture. The Gestapo and the SS established total control over the army. The officers knew that any expression of doubt, any hint of defeatism, could cost not only their careers, but also their lives, and not only themselves, but also their families. After July 1944, the war turned into an absolutely senseless bloodletting caused by inertia, terror, and the complete collapse of rationality. Every sane person saw that Germany was surrounded, that its cities were turning into ruins under bombing, that the Allies were advancing from the west, and the Red Army from the east. But the war machine continued to work, grinding hundreds of thousands of lives for the sake of goals that could no longer be achieved. The generals continued to perform their functions like mechanical dolls. They developed defense plans, deployed troops, and organized counterattacks. In May 1945, the guns finally fell silent. Germany surrendered unconditionally, and the reckoning began, not only for the ordinary perpetrators of the crimes of the Nazi regime, but also for the generals who claimed they were just soldiers doing the duty. The myth of the pure Wehrmacht. After the war, many German generals tried to create a myth about the pure Wehrmacht, that the army was separate from the crimes of the Nazi regime, that the military were just professionals doing the job. They blamed Hitler, the SS, the party, anyone but themselves. They claimed that they had foreseen the disaster and tried to prevent it. Some portrayed themselves as almost victims of a mad dictator who did not listen to their wise advice. It was a convenient narrative that found some understanding in the West during the Cold War, when former German officers were needed to create a new West German army. But it was a lie. The Wehrmacht was deeply involved in the crimes of the Nazi regime. The army participated in mass shootings, helped the Einsatzgruppen, and organized the siege of Leningrad, which claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of civilians. And most importantly, these generals knew about the inevitability of defeat, but continued to carry out orders that prolonged the slaughter. Every month, every week, every day of the war after 1943 brought only death and destruction, and nothing else. They could have stopped it. They could have refused. They could try to overthrow the regime. Some tried, and they paid with their lives. But most preferred denial to disobedience. The tragedy of the German generals was not that they did not see defeat, they saw it. It wasn't that they didn't understand the futility of further struggle, they did. Their tragedy was that they did not find the will to stop this madness. Their professionalism, their discipline, their dedication to duty, everything that should have made them great military leaders, has turned into a curse. A silent surrender. Many of Hitler's generals capitulated in their hearts long before the official surrender on May 8, 1945. They saw things that Hitler could not or did not want to see. They understood the reality that the Fuhrer denied until his last breath in his Berlin bunker. They knew the mathematics of war. Germany was fighting three of the world's greatest industrial powers at the same time, and victory was impossible in such a war. The fate of Germany was not decided in 1945, when Soviet soldiers stormed the Reichstag. Not in 1944, when the Allies landed in Normandy. Not even in 1943 near Kursk or Stalingrad. It was solved in 1941, when the German generals mistakenly mistook the lightning war for omnipotence, when they believed in the possibility of a quick victory over the Soviet Union. At the same time, they dragged Germany into a war of attrition that she could not win. They continued to fight after they realized defeat. And that was the greatest fault. Because every day of this senseless war brought not victory closer, but only the final destruction of the nation they swore to serve. In the end, they had nothing to believe in, and that was probably the worst verdict.